Welcome to the Champion Faction, where I share my love of Stonemaier games. I'm Jason Martin, and today I have a real special video for you. This is a first for my channel and the first type of video that I've done like this. I am so excited to have the designer of Stonemaier's newest game, Apiary, on today. Connie Vogelmann is a first-time designer. Apiary is her first published game, and she agreed to come on and participate in an interview with me. In this interview, we talk about Apiary. We talk about the mechanisms and her kind of process of working through mechanisms and design. We talk about the development process through, from the pitch to publishing. And then we talk about gaming culture and beekeeping and all sorts of fun topics. So I really feel privileged that and honored that Connie agreed to participate in this interview, and I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Connie Vogelmann, to the Champion Faction. This is a real honor for me, and I thank you for taking the time. I think maybe I could just get started. You're new to, at least to me, and my understanding is that this is your first published game. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What got you into board gaming, and as a fan, as an enthusiast, who is Connie Vogelmann?
Yeah, sure. Well, so first, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to be here, and happy to talk a little bit. As you said, Apiary is my first published game. I don't tend to have the biggest online presence, so happy to answer some questions. So in terms of who I am, it's not a lot to tell. So I live in Washington D.C. I'm an attorney by trade. That's kind of my day job. I got into board games actually in law school. I had played a few games growing up. I mean, we played a lot of Pinochle with my family. That was the big family get-together event. I played a lot of cribbage. We actually played a game called Kismet that I've never heard anyone talk about before. It's a version of Yahtzee, but with colored dice. So it was definitely the precursor to the roll and write movement. But then never played games, for quite a while, until I had a friend in law school who invited me over for dinner and a board game. And I was like, come on, a board game? Like, how old are we? And he's like, don't worry. Like, I promise, I know you're going to love this game. And it was Settlers of Catan. And I did. And it just kicked off a movement. I mean, I started a board game group at my law school. And then when I moved to Washington, D.C. after law school, I joined basically every meetup group I could find because I didn't really know a lot of folks. Most of those ended up being board game groups, and then it kind of took off from there. So most of my social network in DC, my partner, and everyone else I met through board games. So they became a really big part of my life over the last few years.
Yeah. Catan was one of those intro games for me as well. I didn't really get into like board gaming as a hobbyist or as a enthusiast until much later, but certainly I that was a pivotal moment for me as well. So, yes. So how long have you been thinking about or playing around with design and thinking about designing a game?
Yeah. So Apiary really is my first designed game in addition to my first published game. So, and this might say something about kind of, gender roles and what we think we can and cannot do, but I would have never thought about designing a game until my partner actually had an idea for a game, and I offered to help in a very supportive capacity. I was like, oh, I can help run play tests. I can do a little bit of graphic design stuff. Not that I'm very good at it, but like I'm happy to try. And that lasted about 2 months. We realized that we cannot design together. I started to more of the process, and we have absolutely opposite styles of working. But that 2 or 3 month experience was enough to really kind of give me the design bug. And I was like, wait a second, I think I can actually do this. This is really fun. I'm really, really enjoying it. And then that was sort of when I had the idea for Apiary, and then I was kind of off to the races. So that was about 2019 timeframe.
Oh, wow. So when do you look back and say, this is really where I started designing Apiary? Like what was the impetus for that?
Yeah, so I was having a conversation with some friends. As I said, we played a lot of board games, and we were kind of chatting about worker placement games in particular, and how oftentimes some of the older school style games, and I think we were talking about Lords of Waterdeep in particular, have this kind of decision where you increase workers until you don't. And I think that's true
Mhm.
in Agricola too, getting that, having everything set up to grow that new worker is really critical, but it's often not as interesting as it should be, because it's kind of like at the beginning of the game, you get another worker, you prioritize getting another worker, maybe you
Mhm.
prioritize two, and then you stop, and then that's done.
Mhm.
And it seemed
Mhm.
a little bit limiting. And we had been playing Village as well. And that in that case, your workers don't age and die, but you do have kind of a worker pool that changes over the course of the game. You gradually kill off your workers essentially, and sort of
Yeah.
how interesting that dynamism would be in a game. And we couldn't really come up with a lot of examples of games that were like that. I mean, Teotihuacan has done that to an extent, and there's certainly been others since then. But at the time, there wasn't a lot that really had that. And so we're talking about it, and I was like, wow, that would be a really cool game. And then all of a sudden, I was like, oh my god, bees, because
Mhm.
I wasn't a beekeeper at the time, but I was like starting to get ready to become one. My grandfather kept bees, so it was certainly something that I was familiar with, and the two just kind of clicked almost instantly, and that's kind of where apiary started.
Wow. Yeah. So you mentioned a lot about worker placement. So it sounds like just playing a lot of worker placement games. Is that your favorite mechanism? Was that? I mean, it feels like a natural fit for a game about bees. What was it about worker placement that you're drawn to?
Well, I actually think it isn't probably quite worker placement. If I had to pick a favorite mechanism, it might actually be dice placement, which is
Hmm.
obviously a very closely related sibling. But I
Yeah.
really, really like the concept of choosing which worker has to go where. And I
Hmm.
really like that extra bit. And one of the things that I really like about it is it allows you, I think, a lot of depth of decision without a lot of rules burden. And that's always the sweet spot for me in games because
Yeah.
and I've talked about this in other places, but Voyages of Marco Polo, Grand Austria Hotel, anything by that design group, they're using these dice, and it's so cool because either the number or the pips are so consequential to what you can do with those dice that it just opens up this whole world. But you don't have a lot of rules. You don't have a lot of complexity. I know that if I put a dice on the spot, I can do the action, but the strength will depend on which dice I place. And I think that's
Yeah.
really fascinating decision space when I'm playing, and also a fun design space as well.
Yeah, so I want to get a little bit more into apiary now. So specifically with, um, I haven't played it. Obviously, I haven't
Yeah,
played the
yeah, no
game. It's
worries.
not
Yeah,
out. I don't have a pre-review copy
yep,
or
yep.
anything like that. But there are a number of mechanisms, and I'm always fascinated when I see a lot of mechanisms coming together in intricate ways. So there's worker placement, there's tableau building, there's resource management. You have these variable worker abilities, variable player powers, all that kind of stuff. Um, how did you go about selecting the different mechanisms to include in the game? At its core, it is a worker placement game, but there's so much other stuff that it connects into that decision space. What did you think about, or what did you evaluate in looking at what to include in terms of mechanisms?
Yeah, so this it really kind of came ground up. I mean, very much from this concept of okay, you have these bees, they're aging and dying. All right, what are the bees doing? They're building a
Hmm.
hive, they're preparing for winter. And so there was always a tableau building element, and that's actually probably one of the elements in the game that might have changed the least over the course of
Hmm.
time. I was going back through some of my old files and I was like, oh, that's just this tile. Like it has a new name now, but it's the exact same tile. And there's obviously been a lot of things that have been added. And so that was sort of very central to the game. And then a lot of the other things were just kind of trial and error. I mean, for the first few versions of the game, I had a map. You were exploring a map.
Oh yeah.
And that didn't last very long. And, I tried a whole bunch of kind of mechanisms or little puzzles to do the resource collection because it's like, well, you need some way to collect resources. Like, what's going to be thematic? What's going to be like? And again, for a while, I had fields that you would like collect and you'd bring into your personal tableau, which is like insane. That doesn't make any sense at all. But I was just trying to kind of make something work. I mean, something that would work from both a thematic and a mechanical standpoint.
Hmm.
So it really wasn't sort of going about thinking, okay, what can I add? It was more, I know this core is these workers aging and dying. I know the core thing that they're going to be is building a hive. How can I make the rest of the game support that? And that was really how the rest of the game came to be.
Wow. Yeah. So just looking at what mechanisms make sense given the theme, given the overall structure, the overall loop that maybe you'd already established that just enhances that or makes sense with it.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned some of the resource constraints too, and a lot of that really is pulling from real life bees. I mean, a big thing that you do
Hmm.
when you're a beekeeper is you have to make sure the bees have enough space, but not too much space. And so there's is this real sense of kind of capacity limits in your hive, and that has really transferred over to the game too, because it doesn't make
Mm,
sense for bees to just be able to collect unlimited resources. Like they have to put it somewhere. Uh,
right, right, right. Yeah, that's a good point. Um, so were there? You already mentioned one sort of. I mean, there is an exploration spot, and in a sense, you're kind of building a map of planets.
Mhm.
But were there some mechanisms or elements of gameplay that you tried but ultimately cut from the game that you just decided didn't work for whatever reason?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the big one is definitely the resource collection one because I just had so many
Mm,
different things. And what I ended up finding with a lot of them is they were really complicated. And then they also prohibited people from getting the resources that they wanted. For a while, I had three types of pollen in the game. I had, a blueberry, alfalfa, and orange, I think, or something like that. And that were represented by different colors. And the frustrating thing is, a lot of the systems that I set up, had like a sliding market or something like that, and people
mm,
were just not able to get one of the types that they needed, and it just ended up being really frustrating. And so I built a lot of rules around like, okay, let's make sure that everyone can get access to everything, and it just ended up being so many rules. So
yeah.
actually, I think probably it was the last or second to last part of the game that actually clicked into place was that exploration system.
Mm,
And I think one of the coolest things about the game is the idea that these bees are, going out into the galaxy and they're making or into the universe, I guess, and making life better on some of these planets and improving them, which you
yeah,
can.
I love the idea of them pollinating other planets. I love that idea.
And that was added at the very end. I mean, that was
Mm,
added really late. I think it's brilliant because it really ties in with the theme well, and it also solves that problem because you as the player, when you explore, are putting a resource onto the planet. You always get some amount of control of what you're collecting, and then that also
mhm.
affects the board state for everyone else. And so I think that's a really, really great way to solve a lot of problems in an elegant way. And one other thing on that too that I just have to mention, probably the saddest thing that I ended up cutting from the game was this explore system that used to be on a grid system. So you'd have an X and a Y axis. So you'd have two worker placement spots. One was associated with the X axis, one was associated with the Y axis. And so you'd be basically bumping those two spots individually. And I really wanted it to work, and it just didn't. It was too limited,
Oh,
too restrictive because you could only place one worker at a time. You'd be
mhm.
like, well, I really want this other planet and I just can't get it. And it would be locked out for, a third of the game or something like that. So didn't work, but I still think it was kind of a clever concept.
Well, and one of the things I'm really impressed with, especially with worker placement games in particular, is how the designer has to evaluate and understand each worker placement spot independently. There are a number of worker placement games that I've played in the past where the there are certain spots that are very beneficial to go for early and much less so, in fact, maybe even just ridiculously unimportant later, and then vice versa.
Yeah.
um Having not played this game, I don't really know how that works here, but like, how did you go about thinking of the process of each individual worker placement spot being valuable on its own, but then also fitting into the collective whole?
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And and I will say there are certainly spots that you're going to use more in apiary than others. I mean, your
Mhm.
explore spot, it's your primary mechanism for generating resources. I mean, you're just
Right.
probably going to go to that spot a few times during the game, but there's a couple of other spots where you might not go to all that much depending on your faction. However, I wanted to do a couple of specific things with apiary because of that particular issue. I really wanted to make sure that there was no one right first move. I mean, there's nothing that kills a game for me more than, oh, the first player in turn order does this, the second player does this, the third player does this, the fourth player does this. And I did a lot of that actually with the factions. And that's a big part of the reason that everyone has variable starting resources, is it because it
Mhm.
opens up different options for the different players. But in terms of trying to sort of balance the different spots, I did a lot of during the prototyping process tracking who took which action when, how many times each action was taken. I know that there's a breed spot, that gives you new workers. We've
Mhm.
actually added a couple of extra things to that spot just to beef it up a little bit. So now it's where you go to expand your ship as well if you want to make your ship bigger. It's also where you go if you want to upgrade your faction because all of the faction abilities are double sided. And so I think we sort of did a lot of that specifically to make sure, like, okay, are all of these spots, if not equally valuable, at least worth considering, and worth
Yeah.
considering. And again, getting away from that first you do this, second you do this, third you do this, because we just really didn't want that in a game. We wanted it to be much more free flowing.
Well, and I think it's helped by the fact that the workers eventually expire. They have to go into hibernation. So you get in a lot of worker placement games, you get a worker and then you have it for the rest of the game. In this game, that's not the case. And so you may in your second to last turn, you may need to go back to that or something like that. You may need to go get another worker fairly late in the game
Yep.
because you've cycled through so many workers over the course of the game. And so I think that really makes that valuable on its own, just getting more workers.
Yep, absolutely. Because I think it really sets up this very interesting decision because, like, if you don't get any more workers, or if, you get a
Mhm.
couple workers at the beginning and you're like, all right, I have my 4 workers. All I'm going to do is play the rest of the game with these 4 workers. Your
Mhm.
decision space gets really tight, and you might
Yeah.
end up because other players know that you're doing that, and they will just go out of their way to not bump you. So all you might be doing for a turn is you place a worker, then the next turn you retrieve it and you collect a single income. That's not a good spot to be in. Um, you might, you can definitely make that work if that's how you want to play. But I think it really kind of opens up this, okay, I know we're in the last third of the game, but if I get a couple more workers now, I'm going to have a lot more flexibility. Both because you have more workers that you can place, but then also when you're retrieving, you collect income basically for one
Mhm.
on a different farm tile for each worker that you retrieve. And so it's a very legitimate strategy in apiary to try to retrieve as many workers as you can because some of those income benefits are really, really good. So that's
Yeah.
another reason that you really might want to have a big workforce at the end of the game. And not to mention there's some scoring conditions for having, bees that are alive and things like that. So there are certainly a lot of different incentives that pull you in different directions.
Yeah, and that was another thing I forgot to mention was the act of retrieval feels a lot more rewarding because you
Hmm.
know that you're going to be getting a lot more stuff through that retrieval process. It doesn't feel like a dead turn.
Yep, it really doesn't, and it's something that you can sort of look forward to. I actually got my copy on last week, and was finally able to play it with the final version. And I don't know how many turns I was like, so basically, what happens when your worker gets bumped, you have a choice. You can either essentially put it into a little holding area, then you can, when you do a retrieve turn, you take it back, or you can directly age it and put it back into your active pool. If you do that, you obviously get the worker, but you skip the income. And I don't know
Mhm.
how many times I got my worker bumped, and I was like, oh no, what do I do? I want this worker, but I also want the income. And so I think
Yeah.
that's a very interesting decision that also you're making on other players' turns, which is kind of fun too,
Mhm.
because somebody will bump your worker on their turn, and then you have to think like, oh, does this change my plan? Does this change my strategy? So it keeps you kind of engaged throughout, which I think is nice.
Well, it changes not in the sense that, oh, I can't do what I wanted to do. It's like now I have more options. I
Yeah.
can, I had a plan for what I was going to do, but now there's this other option that I wasn't necessarily counting on. How do I account for that in my strategy? That's a great place to be in, I think.
Well, and I think it also makes the interaction among other players feel a little bit more positive. I mean, I don't ever want to bump somebody's worker. I don't feel
Hmm.
thrilled about giving them a worker back,
Hmm.
but it also just creates an opportunity that, every time I get bumped, I have another option. Every time somebody places, especially a high strength drone or a high strength worker on the board, it gives you a lot of extra options. Like if somebody places a 4 on the board, all of a sudden I might be able to explore a different planet. I might be able to buy a tile that I wasn't able to before. And so that kind of changing board space state often feels, I mean, sometimes it can feel bad if somebody takes the tile you want, but it also can oftentimes feel very, very good, which is a nice way to interact with other people.
Yeah. I just think it's a really interesting way to look at it and very rewarding, especially because a lot of the earlier worker placement games and still worker placement games, the idea of the worker is that it's blocking spaces. And in this case, and in a few other games that I've played, I've really enjoyed, they're never blocking spaces. They are they're creating that bumping opportunity for whatever is built into the game that means. And I really like that as a or um, as a comparison to like workers blocking spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a space that I would much
Hmm.
rather be in when I'm playing and designing as well. I mean, I think Euphoria is the first game that I know of that did it. We got a lot of enjoyment out of Charterstone, which uses the same
Yep.
mechanism, and that definitely directly inspired the bumping mechanism here. I mean,
Hmm.
I sort of think back to Agricola. It's obviously one of the older, more famous worker placement games, and sometimes it just felt like such a race to the bottom because, like, if you need wood, you need wood, and if
Yeah.
someone else is grabbing wood every single turn, they're just grabbing that 2 wood, and you're like, what am I supposed to do? I can grab 2 wood that's totally worthless and totally inefficient, or
Uh-huh.
they get it and it's gone. And so I do think it's a more interesting decision space to be in when it's not just presence or absence. And I know too that there's been a lot of other systems that have been developed more recently. I think of like Raiders of the North Sea has a very cool system, and in that case, essentially no spot is ever blocked because you're always placing a worker and picking up another worker. So you might have to do it either first or second, which is opposite from what you're planning. But that has sort of a similarly, everything is always available. It's just about sequencing and timing, which I really like.
I want to move now to talking about the queenship. So the explore action. I think you said that was one of the last things that kind of came together. That part of the game. The queenship is very cool. But such a shared component, a component that all the players interact with, I think is kind of rare in a game like this. I think of like the airship Kai in the expansion to My Little Scythe comes to mind as being similar. Where did you get that idea, and was that part of the original design, like to have that shared component? Where did that come from?
Yeah, so that was Jamie's idea. It was Jamie's addition.
Okay.
He might have very well been inspired by My Little Scythe on that. I'm not sure. But again, we were just having a little bit of a hard time with this explore and really making it thematic. So we were kind of brainstorming, and he had the idea of like, what if you have a shared ship? And it seemed to make a lot of sense. And we went through a few different iterations. There was one version I liked for a while that didn't quite work, but the queen ship was actually carrying resources around. So you basically like put a resource from the queen ship onto the planet, and then I can't remember how, but somehow you got another resource back on. So the queen ship always was carrying around 3 resources, and you sort of seeded them that way. And we ended up getting rid of it because it was just a few too many roles, and it didn't really do all that much extra. But I do think that's a really cool shared space of interaction, because the other thing too is, these planets that are explored are getting better over the course of the game. Most or all of them will give you 1 or 2 resources the first time you explore them. But by the end, some of them are giving you 3 resources. So even if they're not exactly what you want, you're still just, your actions are getting more efficient, which really contributes to the sense of growth over the course of the game.
Yeah. And if you're, together with the mechanism that you can only keep a certain number of resources on your player mat, and then whatever you don't keep, you still get some kind of reward for with the Queen's favor. It means that at some point, it doesn't really matter what resources you're getting. At the end of the day, you're getting something valuable.
Yep, absolutely. And I think Queen's favor is one of those things. So it was initially added because it felt bad. It felt bad if people went over their capacity limits and had to discard down. And I think the game has fewer capacity limits than they did before. It's not quite, there were certain versions of the game when you just never had any capacity, and this version has a bit more than that. But one of the things that I absolutely love now is it's a legitimate strategy. If you get to the end of the Queen's favor track, it's 25 points. And I mean, a good score in apiary is somewhere around 80 or 90, something like that. So it's a really significant chunk of points, but you have to really focus on it and build around it, which I really, really, really like, because I think it's very cool that it turns this very superfluous, I have a couple extra resources, into like an actual strategy in the game.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so talk a little bit about the process of developing the game, beginning with your pitch. So I understand that you pitched this at Design Day and actually went back and found the blog post that Jamie had written about the Design Day that you were at. And it was cool to see, oh, wait, now I know what has happened to that game a little bit. And I'm sure the game is a little different than it was at that time. But talk a little bit about the process of pitching at Design Day. What prompted you to take it to that? What was that like?
Yeah, absolutely. So Design Day was a great experience. This is something that I had actually planned to do in, I think, 2020, and then COVID happened. So it got pushed back to 2021. But, we've been fans of Stonemaier for a long time. Obviously, there was the Charterstone Euphoria connection with Apiary. And I was actually a blind playtester. I was a lead playtester for Stonemaier for a couple years before Design Day, so I was sort of plugged into the network. At one point, I remember just getting really frustrated with some of the discussion on the Tapestry forums, and I had sort of messaged Jamie, and I was like, "Can I be a playtester? I want to be a playtester." And so I got looped into the network. And so part of the reason that I went was just that it seemed like Apiary was a very kind of good weight for Stonemaier. Not that necessarily certainly wasn't expecting to get it signed or anything. I mean, that's not something that one goes in expecting. But I knew it was kind of the right weight. It seemed like a really good event. I'd heard really good things about it, and about the event from other people. It also gave me a good target to work toward. I tend to work better on deadlines. So even if I don't have a real deadline, I make up a fake deadline. having this kind of big event where I knew a lot of folks were going to be, it would be a really good opportunity to play test it. I really kind of set my sights on, okay, I'm going to have the very best version of this prototype I possibly can before design day. And so
Yeah,
I,
I've read that your prototype materials were really good, like better than a lot of prototypes that have been discussed.
yeah, I think I sort of stumbled into that, honestly, because I know that, I'm not a graphic designer, I'm not a software developer, I don't
Hmm.
do coding or anything like that by trade. But I do think that I can do a pretty good job. I think I'm a good writer, which really helps with rulebooks. But I think I'm also good at putting myself into the shoes of the playtester, the shoes of the player. And so it's a lot of things like, okay, if I was new to this game, how do I phrase things? How do I make the icons to make it as easy to follow as possible? I mean, it's basically just trying to reduce the barriers to entry as much as possible. Um, but yeah, so I had actually emailed Jamie before Design Day, basically saying, "Hey, can you consider this game?" And he basically said, "Well, I'll take a look. I'm busy during Design Day, but I'll try to take a look."
Hmm.
He actually didn't get a chance to do much with it at Design Day, but he did send a friend to play test it.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I think the friend reported back that, like, oh, I think this game has a fair bit of promise. And then I
Yeah.
actually worked with Jamie for about 2 months after Design Day because Jamie basically came back and he said, look, I think there's still a few rough edges. I'm also kind of concerned that, Honey Buzz just came out. Honey Buzz is a midweight worker placement game with bees. Um, would you consider moving it to space? And I was like, absolutely. That's a great idea.
Oh wow! So I didn't know if I wanted to ask about whether or
That's
not that was
fine.
a good thing on your part. I didn't know if that would be a touchy subject, but that is very unusual. So, and I knew that it wasn't originally that, and so it sounds like that was an idea that you were enthusiastic about.
I was actually very enthusiastic about it. I'm a really big science fiction fan.
Okay.
So I know people have talked a lot about Adrian Tchaikovsky's. Oh my God, I'm completely blanking on
Oh
the name of the series, but it's the one with the first book is about spiders, and so there's certainly some
yes.
to apiary. I've also Werner Vinge is one of my favorite authors, and both A Fire Upon the Deep and A Deepness, Fire Upon the Deep and Deepness in the Sky, Deepness Upon the Sky.
Hmm.
I'm blanking on everything today, but anyway, those are two fantastic books that explore similar themes. So I was really ready to jump on board. I'll say too, it also to solve some design problems, because to a certain extent, I'm having these bees do this hive building, but like, why are these like technological advances? Like, what's happening here?
Yeah.
These are smart, but they're not that smart, and so it
Yeah.
kind of solves a lot of design problems as well. So I was fully on board with that, and then we signed the game in about November. Of 2021 and then started the blind playtesting process, which is absolutely amazing. Their blind playtesters and development process is truly phenomenal. And I think, as far as the designer is concerned, or at least as far as I'm concerned, it's about the best process I possibly could have imagined. So we
Hmm.
basically send the design out for a wave of blind playtesting. The playtesters would submit reports, basically a quick like Google survey after every playtest, and then a several page write up when they were done. And then Jamie would take a look at it, consolidate all the feedback, let me know what he thought his 10 or 15, biggest takeaways were, and then send me all of the files and basically say, all right, what do you think? And then after every wave of playtesting, we'd have a lot of back and forth of like, okay, I agree with this point. I don't agree with this point. What if we tweak this? What if we tweak that? I'd work on the files and then we do it all over again. And that was just an absolutely wonderful process. Like being involved like that from
Yeah.
starters was really amazing.
Yeah, I have no idea how that process works at other companies because Jamie is so open and I mean his weekly live chat talks a lot about the process of development and including blind playtesting, but it feels fairly robust and just incredibly efficient to get a lot of information and to help refine a game, and so I can't imagine there being a better system than what he has set up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's different for every designer. Absolutely. I mean, I've talked with some designers who basically want to sign the game and walk away, and that's
Hmm.
crazy to me. I was
Hmm.
really glad to be involved throughout it. I've heard there's. I think every publisher is going to be a lot different. I mean, some of the folks that I know in the design community, it's everything from the publisher takes it and says, "Okay, I'll send you a check when it's done,"
Yeah.
and no say in it at all, to okay, it's signed, let us know when it's done and we'll hit the print button. I mean, and it's just here's our distro list of play testers, but it's up to you to coordinate everything. And so I think
Hmm.
what Stonemaier does for me at least just strikes out the absolute perfect balance where they kind of run everything, they control things, but the designer is absolutely involved in every stage of the way. And I want to give Jamie a lot of credit here too, because I mean I was a brand new designer that he'd never worked with, no one had ever heard of. And he always solicited my feedback and made it very clear that even when we disagreed, and I think we basically got to a solution we could live with just about all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But even where we disagreed, he was always paying a lot of attention and sort of respecting my opinion and everything. And I really, really appreciate that. So.
Yeah, that's great, and I think it's great when when it works and when you have a good person to work with. But that's taking a big risk. I mean,
Absolutely.
if you weren't, for Jamie to kind of put that kind of faith in you, if you weren't as competent and efficient and responsible, it might not work out so well. So that's pretty impressive that he is able to put that kind of faith into the people he works with.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
So, so Jamie mentioned in the release announcement that you may be working with them on Stonemaier Games on other projects. I know you can't say anything about it, but after learning about Apiary, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you might do next. I wanted to kind of shift gears a minute and kind of talk about the board gaming community and culture, which I've been into board games since about 2015 or 2016 is around the time that I started really diving in and going to websites and following the publishing of games and watching YouTube channels and stuff like that. And so there's been a lot of attention paid to the culture of the hobby, both good and bad. One aspect is helping board gaming to become more inclusive of diverse populations, both in who are playing and who's making games. I've really appreciated following Elizabeth Hargrave and the way that she has become a really strong advocate for diversity in gaming, and I've appreciated hearing her speak on such matters. So I was wondering if you could give me your take on what your experience has been in the board gaming community overall. And I know that in terms of like name recognition, you may just now be getting, having your name put out there. And I think having a published Stonemaier game will certainly do that. So what have you noticed, positive, negative in terms of inclusiveness of diverse populations in the gaming hobby?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to shout out Elizabeth. I mean, she's wonderful. She's a friend. Designs amazing games and has also been such an amazing voice in the industry. On behalf of kind of diversity and diverse voices, and I absolutely love that. I think it's gotten better over time. I mean, when I first, came to DC in 2014 and went to some of these events, I mean, I was one of the only women there. And I don't think that's, it was basically, frankly, a sea of white men. And I do think that's better. I think some of these groups have gotten more diverse. I think one of the things, though, and one of the conversations that I'd like to sort of see happen a little bit more is not just are people actively excluding others, it's are they going out of their way to include people? Because I think a lot of you'll see a very kind of homogenous board game group. And if you talk to any of the individuals, they're like, oh, we love other people. Like, we're not doing anything to keep people away. And it's like, well, obviously you kind of are, right? Because if it is nothing but 20 and 30 somethings white men, and it's a public group, that probably means you're doing something. And it's probably subtle. And maybe it's just that no one's going out of their way to say, hey, are you new? What's your name? Do you want to play a game? And then trying to play maybe a game that's a little bit simpler, something that's a little bit easier for somebody who hasn't played a lot of games and kind of taking that extra step. And so that's what I'd really like to see kind of at the ground level, because I think it really carries through to the rest of the industry as well. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, why are there so few female designers? And I think there's a lot of contributing factors, but I do think at least one of the parts of it is that probably if you're going to design or publish games or anything like that, you probably need to be in the hobby for a while. I know there's a few folks who have jumped straight in, straight from, I played my first game last year and now I'm designing. And I think that's really great. But I think for a lot of people, it takes a certain amount of time to get comfortable. And so I think basically the more diversity you can get at kind of all of the bottom levels, and I mean, gender, race, ethnicity, orientation, all of that stuff, I think that kind of can carry through all of the other stages as well.
Oh, for sure. Well, I think, board gaming in many ways is about storytelling. So whether it's an abstract storytelling or a very direct storytelling, every Stonemaier game, other than maybe Charterstone and Rise of Fenris and Scythe, those have pretty specific stories that they're telling, but all the other games may not be specific, but they're telling a story. And if the creators, the people who are making those games, if they're all homogenous, if they're all a bunch of straight white American men or even European men,
There's a lot of
then
those too.
yeah, absolutely. You're only going to get like one type of story, or you're going to get, or at the very least, you're going to exclude a lot of other stories that could be told. I think one of the remarkable things was like with Wingspan. Wingspan became such a phenomenon and is such a popular game, way outsizing the board game community as a whole. And I think part of it was because it was designed by someone whose voice we may not have necessarily heard, say, 15 or 20 years ago within that community. So Elizabeth Hargrave was able to tell a story through Wingspan that that typically would not have been told. Not to say that it couldn't have been told, but it wasn't being told, and it wouldn't have been told. And I think that that's the biggest benefit of increasing diversity for the gaming. Just on a pragmatic gaming level, is that you get so much more diversity in what we're participating in.
Absolutely. No, I agree 100%. I think it's sort of similar to, every time a big studio releases some kind of like female forward movie and it makes a lot of money and everyone's like, who
Right.
would this happen? And it's like, well, women go to the movies too.
Yeah.
And with Wingspan, it's not just women, obviously, but I do think, as you said, it pulls in a slightly different point of view, a slightly different worldview. It's very non-competitive. It's competitive, obviously, but it's very non-aggressive.
Right.
I think it kind of is in part responsible for this resurgence or the surge of cozy games that we're seeing now, which I think is really great. Pulled in all the birders, which I think is wonderful. And it also seems to be a game, I follow some of the, Wingspan like Facebook groups and stuff like that. And it seems to be a game that people just play with their partners. I mean, it's a really two-player game. And I think just because it's a little bit less direct head-to-head confrontational, people will play hundreds of games of Wingspan with their partners. And I think that's kind of a space that it just kind of, it hit lightning in a bottle, but it really appealed to a slightly different demographic. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. And I think a lot of the other games, I think of Creature Comforts and Flamecraft and, oh God, there's a million others. Even something like Stadia that, I don't know if those games would have been made if it wasn't for kind of the trailblazing of Wingspan. And so I think it's just wonderful that all of a sudden it's opening up this gaming space to different groups of people and people who like different types of games.
Yeah. Well, it opened up. I knew it was something when I got a call from my aunt, and she and her husband had started playing Wingspan. She was like, "Do you know this? So you're into board games? Do you know this game Wingspan?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, I do." And that got them into board gaming, And so I went over I was at their house earlier this summer, and they had, Wingspan, and they had Viticulture, and they had a bunch of these other games that I kind of consider as hobbyist games, enthusiast games, but have clearly broken out. And I think that I don't know that would have happened. Oh, I know it wouldn't have happened with a game like, and this is a great game, but like Lords of Waterdeep or Scythe. Those are games that I enjoy, but I don't. But that it's not going to appeal to everybody, right?
Well, absolutely. I think it's interesting too. Just this is a little bit of a tangent, but I was in Target. We were visiting my partner's family down in Florida, so kind of middle of very suburban Florida, down in the Vero Beach area, and we went into Target, and they had this giant shelf of board games. They had Root and Lost Ruins of Arnak, and Wingspan, of course. And
Root's no small deal, man. That's a big game.
Yeah. And I looked at the Root was the one that really made me do a double take, because it was like $90 MSRP in Target. And I was like, really? And I think it shows just how more mainstream a lot of these games have become. And I really think it's because of games like Wingspan that, I think Wingspan, by the way, is really funny because it's really not an entry-level game. It's not a simple game.
No.
And I think it's interesting that just the theme and the art and everything was so appealing that it really got people over that hurdle. And then once you play Wingspan, the world of hobby games really opens up to you.
Yeah. So what do you see as kind of the largest area of need in terms of the culture and community of board gaming that you feel still exists? Do you have any recommendations for addressing those needs? That's the $1 million question, I know, but what do you see?
I mean, I wish I had something brilliant to say here, and I really don't. But one thing I will say is it is sort of sobering to see, and this again goes back to Elizabeth, but Elizabeth had a conversation with someone from AEG a few months ago who had said something like he'd heard, hundreds of pitches, and none of the good ones were ever from women. And also, women didn't have the temperament to be game designers, essentially. They couldn't take criticism. And that was something that was said, out loud in a public forum. And he was a fairly high up guy in AEG. He was also speaking to Elizabeth, who I believe has one published AEG game and another one, Mariposa, is coming out.
Wow.
So it's like he sort of said the quiet part out loud. And what's scary to me is that a lot of people might be keeping that to themselves. A lot of these folks who have been in the industry for a long time. And so I do think it's really the responsibility of people who have made some kind of a foothold to kind of keep trying to pull people up to kind of keep pushing against that narrative. Again, I know that's not really a great answer. I don't really have a great one, but I do think what I said before is really key, that I think you need more diverse voices at all levels, starting with at your nightly game group. If you see a new person, be nice to them. Also recognize that they might be in a space, if they're the only person of color, if they're the only woman, if they're the only, gender nonconforming person, anything you want, to just like go out of your way and to kind of welcome, take that extra step and really welcome them in, because I think the hobby is much richer for it. So
yeah, that's kind of what that's part of what I've been trying to do. Is my gaming group has kind of changed over the years, and not because I've kind of shifted from one gaming group to another, and it's not because the first one was all that bad, but because in the new gaming group I'm kind of a part of, it was, I don't know, how do I put this? It just felt easier to bring in new voices. It felt easier just one week to the next to bring, regardless of who they are, but to bring in new people. And so that opened up the opportunity to bring in new people that, that kind of contributed to the diversity of the group, and that we could learn more from in terms of their tastes and in terms of their, just play style. And that's kind of what that's the part that I've been trying to do a little bit better of myself. And I've been rewarded for it.
Well, and we can all do better with it too. I mean, there's been times when you go to game night and you're like, oh, I got this new game, and I really want to play. And you're like, oh, do I really want to break out something light and simple? But I think it's worth it in the long run, even if in that one moment you're like, all right, I'm going to have to put my new game on hold for a week. It's fine. You'll survive. Yeah. And I think the long-term benefits are worth it.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time, but I do want to ask you a few questions about bees.
Absolutely.
First, before we leave. So I understand that you are, in addition to designing a game about bees, you are a beekeeper. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into that? And I'm really interested in, like, what are some of the common misconceptions about beekeeping that you've heard that you'd like to address? I know nothing about beekeeping whatsoever. So educate me a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, happy to talk about bees. So as I mentioned before, my grandfather kept bees, and I have very fond memories of when I was a kid, like spitting the honey extractor, and getting sort of the fresh honey right from the hive. And so, as soon as we got a house, as soon as we got a house, basically, I was like, oh, we have a backyard. DC has very permissive beekeeping rules. So we live in the middle of DC and have bees in our backyard.
Wow.
And so it was something that I'd been really interested in for a while, I think because I kind of had that family history. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about some common misconceptions. And one of them is about bees more generally. And that is, there's this narrative that's going on in the world right now that we need to save our pollinators and the bees are dying. And that's true to an extent. There are some pollinators that are having a really hard time. That's not true of honeybees, though. I mean, honeybees are a European import that we bring in because we like them, because they make honey, and they do do a lot of crop pollination. But a lot of times in in urban areas, the honeybees, there will be so many urban beekeepers, myself included, that it will actually make things even worse for some of the native pollinators. Some of the, other species, there's, hundreds of species of bees that are native to the US, many of which are solitary bees or in very, very small groups, not in the big colonies. And so I think that narrative, I'd love to see that narrative change a little bit. And that's part of the reason, too, that we, Stonemaier is doing a sign up for apiary. If you sign up before, I believe, October 4th, for every person who signs up, they'll donate $1. And we actually supported 2 pollinator conservation groups, not specifically honeybee groups, and then the Heifer International donate a beehive, which is, more about, economic sustainability for folks in different countries. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention. And then the other thing too that I wanted to mention about the actual beekeeping is really fascinating. I really do enjoy it, but I will say that it's a lot different than you think it's going to be. You think it's going to be, oh, you put this beehive in the back and it's lovely and it's pastoral and you watch the bees, and like the actual beekeeping management is difficult. What you don't
Yeah.
realize is there are a lot of pests that will wipe out your bees, and it's everything
Mm.
from mites to beetles to moths. And you always have to check that hive. You always have to be in the hive, and you always have to be like checking all of the different boxes. And so when you get a box of honey on top of a beehive, that can easily be 50, 60 pounds, something like that. And
Mm.
you are lifting these 50, 60-pound boxes of honey that have thousands and thousands of stinging insects on them so that you
Mm.
can put pesticide in the bottom of your hive to basically wipe out whatever is going after them. And so it's just it's very much livestock management, just on a very, very small scale. I mean, it's imagine
Yeah.
you have a field of cattle, except they're all, in a box. And so it's just been a really fascinating experience. And I've learned much more about like mites
Yeah.
than I've ever thought that I would, specifically with beekeeping. So it's just very, very different. I will say, though, too, that the beekeeping community here is absolutely amazing. And I've heard that that's true elsewhere. So if anyone's interested in beekeeping, join your local beekeeping group, because these are people who love bees and have decades and decades of experience and would absolutely love to welcome a new person into the
Yeah.
fold. And that's my experience in DC. So.
Well, to that end, I sent you a link to something I had found on
Yeah.
Kickstarter just a couple of days ago, like 3D printed beehives, and it looks cool. To your point, I don't think I quite got the impression about it being like as much work as it really is. It kind of
Yeah.
feels like, and I'm not faulting the creator for this, but it kind of, just looking through the page and watching their video, it did look like the kind of thing, oh, you just 3D print these components, put it out there, and, congratulations, you'll have honey pretty soon. But,
Well,
but it's clearly not that easy.
Well, and I think it's a fine line, because I mean, I certainly want there to be, innovation in every field, right?
Yeah.
Just it's been something that we've always done doesn't mean we have to stick that way. And I mean, to a certain extent, the bees don't care. They don't care what you
Hmm.
stick. I mean,
Hmm.
if it's a hollow tree, if it's your standard kind of Langstroth hive, which is what most beekeepers use, or if it's like a top bar hive, if it's this, 3D printed hex, I mean, they don't care what the shape is. The thing that always concerns me a little bit about some of those, well, there are actually two specific things. And one is with the size of those. I wondered how far north they could make it, because bees do
Mm.
need a certain amount of insulation to overwinter, which they tend to get from volume. But the other thing too is just anything non-standard comes with risks, because it's not going to work with anything else. And
Right.
so, for instance, there's a standard size honey extractor that use standard size frames, and if you don't have a standard size frame, it's very hard to actually extract your honey. You can
Mm.
jerry-rig something. I mean, it's just all it is something that spins and pulls the honey out of the comb. So I mean, sure, you could make your own extractor. But I think there's a lot of benefit to having standard size equipment. I mean, for instance, I have a mentor who helps me a lot. Still, I mean, beekeeping is, as I said, it's difficult. And this is an individual with, 30, 40 years of beekeeping experience. And he'll help me where I need it. But we're always passing equipment back and forth. I mean, I don't have a lot of space. So if my bees split, they need to go somewhere else. So he'll grab the frames, he'll help prop up another hive that needs extra help. He'll bring some extra frames back, we're always swapping in and out equipment. So I think it's really tough to go to something non-standard. And it's something that I wouldn't recommend to new beekeepers. I think it's something that if you've been doing it for a while, like absolutely do it. I think it's great. It might be really rewarding, but I would be really hesitant to say, yes, sign up, have this be your first foray into beekeeping.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. I have to admit, I was considered it for half a second, and then I
Yeah,
thought, I
yeah.
am the wrong person to be doing that. That is not something I need in my life right now, for my sake and for the bees' sake. So, I think it's cool that people like you are eager to participate in that. So, also knowing next to nothing about bees, there are a couple of elements um, of apiary that I just thought were fascinating. One is the dance, which I
Absolutely.
recently found out, is kind of that the bees in, real bees in nature do this bee dance. And then the other is the carve. I don't really know much about carving. Is that part of, or is that part of the
No,
sci-fi implementation of?
that's part of the sci-fi. I mean,
Okay.
so it's taken from, bees basically draw comb onto their frames. I mean, they basically
Yeah.
make the comb structure out of wax. I mean, a lot of the frames that you use as a beekeeper have it kind of pre-started, so you're trying to get them to build to the right size, but they'll build the hex pattern regardless. So it really kind of came from that, like, well, what if this building of wax made something a lot more elaborate? The dances, though, are really cool, and those are made based on. So the way it works in apiary is you can basically teach a dance, which is a new conversion in the game, and so there's a series of tiles, and then there are several kind of big rectangular dance tiles that say basically blank plus blank equals blank. And you, as the player, when you teach a dance, can fill in what those things are. And they're all in slightly different configurations. And that's really based on their waggle dances, which is how bees communicate to each other. So if a forager finds a really good field or a really good source of resources, they will come back to the hive, and then they will actually communicate it through the way they turn and how they move their bodies to the other foragers, and they'll manage to communicate how good the find is, where it is, and how to get there, which is absolutely fascinating for creatures whose, I don't know, brain is the size of a
Yeah.
But they do a lot.
Is there like have humans learned how to translate that waggle, that dance? Can we, observe a bee doing the dance and be able to discern what they're telling the other bees?
I think so. I don't know how reliable it is, but I know there's been a
Hmm.
lot of studies of it, and I think you can sort of, I know, for instance, how good it is has to do with like the frequency of the waggle or just how much they waggle. Basically, the more they waggle, the better it is. And so
Wow.
I do think we've, more or less decoded how they do it. And bees do a lot of other really, really cool things. I mean, something I actually just learned yesterday. We were doing a honey harvest, and I didn't realize that they did this, but for a few minutes we had some of the frames out of the hives, to get the honey, and then we are going to put the frames back in.
Mhm.
And when we opened the hive back up, the bees were chaining across the gap, and they were basically all. It was a chain of bees. I mean, think a necklace, but bees. And apparently, they're measuring the distance to start redrawing the comb because they don't know that we're going to put the frame back in, and that's how
Oh,
they measure.
wow.
There are more than one bee, and how they do it, I don't know how they communicate that or know that, but that's what they do.
They're
So
creating their own tape measure in a sense.
yes, with their own
Wow.
bodies.
Yeah, yeah. That's
um,
incredible.
Yeah, so
Wow.
so they do a lot of really, really cool things. And so I think they're just perfect fodder for a game. And I think they're really, really fascinating creatures. And so even if the narrative of, bees are in danger, all the bees are dying is maybe not 100% accurate the way that it's often,
Hmm.
you know, often told, I still think bees are really, really fascinating creatures. And I'm glad to kind of show people a little more about them. So.
Yeah. I agree. I don't know anything about it, but especially in terms of the insect world, they seem incredibly resourceful and important. Compared to something like a mosquito or a cockroach, it's like, well, bees are a heck of a lot better than that. So
Yeah.
that's
Although
wonderful.
honestly, though, maybe apiary should have been the cockroach game because I do kind of think the cockroaches are going to outlast us all.
Oh, for sure. Actually, if we're talking about like humans have long since died out for unknown reasons, and there's an insect that has overtaken the world, it'll be the cockroach. I'm convinced
Oh
of it.
yeah. Oh yeah, almost certainly. But they're a little
Yeah.
bit less fun. They're a little less fun to make a game about.
Right. Right. Well, Connie, I want to thank you for joining me today. I think those were all the questions that I was looking for. With one more exception, I want to close out. Um, if you what are some of the like real on the top of your mind games that you're thinking about? Like you can talk about your favorite games or just games that you're really interested in, really enthusiastic about. What's on your mind in terms of games that you're interested in other than
Yeah.
apiary?
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, other than apiary, because I have to say I've been thinking about that one a lot lately.
Absolutely. Yeah,
But
a lot of us have at this point.
yeah. So I've been playing a lot of Forest Shuffle on Board Game Arena. I've been absolutely enjoying that game. It's a little tableau builder with split cards. So when you're
Okay.
basically building trees and you're tucking cards under it, but the cards are split. So you either tuck left or right or tuck top or bottom. So every card you're looking at has those two choices, which is really fascinating. I've been loving that game a lot lately. We just got Search for Lost Species, which I'm really excited to get that to the table. We have Search for Planet X, and this is kind of a sequel to that. It's basically a
Oh,
deduction game where I actually haven't played it yet, so I'm not 100% sure how it works, but you're basically using kind of logic rules to try to figure out where this lost species is. We've been playing a lot of Expeditions lately. That one
Hmm.
has been a real hit for our play group, and it seems like every time we bring it, it just is immediately off the table, which has been really great. I've been playing a lot of both Lost Ruins of Arnak and Dune Imperium. I absolutely love the joint worker placement deck building games.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are a lot of the ones that I've been playing a lot lately. So
Okay, great. Yeah, Search for Planet X is one that has been on my radar since it first came out. I've never played it, but lately I've been like, I want to figure out how to either buy a copy or find somebody that has a copy. I really want to play that at some point. And Lost Ruins of Arnak and Dune Imperium, those are two staples of my gaming group. So yeah,
I think those are just not ever, both of them are not going to leave my collection for a long time, which is funny because they both have very similar mechanisms, but they feel so different. I mean, they're
yeah.
just very, very different games, but yeah.
And what was the first one you said?
Oh, it's called Forest Shuffle.
Forest Shuffle. I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, it's not out yet. It's on
Oh,
in beta in Board Game Arena. I think it's in beta, and it was one of those that I think it's technically an Essen release, but they had a few copies floating around Gen Con. So that's one that again, it's not out yet, but folks can play it on Board Game Arena, and I've been really, really enjoying it. So
great. Well, that's fantastic. And yeah, I've been playing a fair amount of Expeditions myself,
yep, yep.
as you might suspect. So, well, that's great. Connie, I want to thank you again for joining me today. This has been a really good conversation. I appreciate you taking the time and you know the answers to your question or to my questions were really appreciated. And just thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.